Thank you. The next item of business is a debate on motion 15782 in the name of Shirley Ann Somerville on pathways to global human rights towards a stronger human rights culture in Scotland. I would invite those members who wish to speak in the debate to please press the request to speak buttons. And before I call on the Cabinet Secretary, I note that 2 front bench contributors are not here, which is really not ideal. So hopefully they can be asked to come to the Chamber, and then they will have to apologise to the Chamber and to myself. And with that, I call on Cabinet Secretary Shirley Ann Somerville to speak to and to move the motion. Around 10 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I move the motion in my name. It is a delight and an honour to open this debate marking Human Rights Day 2024. This year's theme is Our Rights, Our Future Right Now. It asks us to reflect on how human rights are a pathway to solutions and a route to a more peaceful, equitable and sustainable world. It is a reminder of the transformative power of human rights. It is fundamentally a message of hope. We are not only marking the signing of the UN Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, but also the founding of the Council of Europe 75 years ago. One of its founding instruments was the European Convention on Human Rights, which laid the cornerstone for a future based on human rights justice and forms part of our domestic law through the Human Rights Act in 1998. It is through the ECHR, along with over 200 treaties, conventions and protocols, that the Council of Europe upholds the rights of millions, holding governments accountable and ensuring that the principles of freedom, dignity and justice are upheld. In the face of war in Europe and the regression of human rights and fundamental freedoms across the region, the work of the Council of Europe remains critical. Indeed, the existence of the ECHR and the various international human rights instruments signed and ratified by the UN member states have never been more vital. The world can feel like an increasingly uncertain place, with values we once took for granted now routinely challenged. Fundamental rights are threatened by a confluence of attacks on civil liberties, a cost of living crisis that has pushed people into poverty and destitution, and a climate crisis which is increasingly devastating the homes and the livelihoods of the most vulnerable in our global community. Today is therefore an opportunity for this Parliament to come together and stand firmly behind the message that human rights are a force for good. It is a chance to show our collective resolve and to recommit to respecting, protecting and fulfilling human rights in everything we do. For as Volker Turk, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, has said, human rights have the power to unify us at a time when we need to come together to contend with the existential challenges we face as humanity. It is clear then that human rights must remain at the centre of renewed action for global peace. In the face of interconnected challenges of climate change, war and population displacement, the hard work of progress can never cease. The devastating full-scale invasion of Ukraine goes on and looks like it will enter a third year. There is still no sign of a ceasefire in Gaza, nor sustained progress towards unimpeded access to humanitarian assistance. And over the weekend, we witnessed and welcomed the fall of the brutal regime in Syria. We join the international community in calling for a peaceful and inclusive political solution that puts the Syrian people first and for humanitarian aid to reach those most in need. The people of Syria have endured unimaginable suffering under the dictatorship of Assad. Their future must now be determined through a peaceful transition that upholds the rights of all Syrians. Presiding Officer, these are just some of the collective challenges the world faces. They require collective solutions underpinned by the shared values set out in our international human rights treaties and agreements. Now, in Scotland, we have been on a journey and there remains much to do. Advancing human rights is central to this government's mission to eradicate the scourge of child poverty, build better public services and to tackle the climate emergency. We should all be proud of this Parliament's work to incorporate the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child into domestic law. The UNCRC Act is helping create a culture of everyday accountability for children's rights across our public authorities, which will make a very real difference to the lives of children and young people in Scotland. And we have further to go, which is why this government has committed to continue work towards a human rights bill that will incorporate further international standards, including important economic and social rights, and make them part of domestic law.
Jeremy Balfour.
I'm grateful to Cabinet Secretary for taking an intervention on that point. Is the government's intention to introduce that bill in this session? Will we see the bill before the next election?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, I've been clear, and I'll come on to this later in my remarks, about the Government's continued commitment to the Human Rights Bill, but this will be a bill that will be introduced in the next session. And one of the reasons for that is with the fact that we have a new UK Government who we have the opportunity to build a genuine working relationship with on human rights. And I'm afraid, with respect to Mr Balfour, that is not the same for his party when they were in government at a UK level. This will help, Presiding Officer, our human rights culture in Scotland when this bill will be passed. It will allow the culture in Scotland's public services to develop and ensure that where rights are not being realised, that this is addressed. It will be complementary to our ongoing work to advance a culture of equality, inclusion and human rights in Scotland, including our proposed mainstreaming strategy, which is currently being consulted upon. Now, as I've said, we have taken the decision to take more time to work on the Human Rights Bill before it's introduced. And I again would put on record that I very much recognise the frustration, indeed the anger that this has caused for many who have worked so hard over so many years on this issue. I do feel, however, that the extra time that we will take over the next 18 months will give us the opportunity to develop this bill still further and to make it stronger. And that is my absolute determination, not just to deliver a bill, but to deliver the strongest bill possible and a workable piece of legislation. Because we need a bill that will deliver on our shared ambition to truly embed a human rights culture across public services. The election of the new UK Government has presented an opportunity to explore the challenges which we have previously had, including how the constraints of the devolution settlement have limited our ability to truly transform incorporation legislation. And we saw that during our debates on the Human Rights Bill Now Act. We want to work on the relationship that we have with the new UK Government to build a constructive and a collaborative relationship on human rights, and I do hope that we will see progress there. But in the meantime, Presiding Officer, it's important that we use this 18 months to further strengthen that bill, as I've said, and we'll shortly share with partners a detailed plan for taking forward bill development over the remainder of this parliamentary session. And as part of this, we're given careful consideration to the publication of a policy paper, building on last year's public consultation and setting out our thinking on the bill overall to support constructive engagement as we continue to test and refine proposals still further. Presiding Officer, at this point I also want to commend and pay tribute to the role of organisations like the Scottish Human Rights Commission, the Human Rights Consortium for Scotland and the many other civil society actors for their positive collaboration with Government to help develop proposals to this point. I know they are deeply, deeply disappointed at the decision that this Government has taken. These organisations, along with individuals that have shared their experiences on how human rights play out in their day-to-day lives, are our human rights defenders. Those individuals who, through those organisations, have taken part in previous consultations, their work remains at the heart of what this Government does in our continued work to advance human rights. Nothing that they have contributed to will be lost, and it will be the foundation of the work that we will continue to do for the rest of this Parliament, to make this bill as strong as they want it to be, and indeed that they have a right to expect from this Parliament. Certainly.
Alex Cohan.
I'm very grateful for the Cabinet Secretary taking my intervention. I recognise what she says about moving the bill into the next session, but does she recognise there are steps we can take in this Parliament to advance the cause of human rights, not least looking at our age of criminal responsibility? She's heard me say many times that we are suboptimal in this country. In fact, we are behind Russia and we are behind China in terms of the age at which we determine children responsible for their criminal actions. Can she speak to the progress the Government is making on that topic?
Cabinet Secretary.
I'm not sure whether Mr Cole-Hamilton can read my speech from where he's sitting, but the next page is next steps, which I'll go on to some of that. But I didn't have a part in my speech about that particular issue, but he'll be aware that this is something which the Scottish Government is committed to reviewing, and we will keep him updated on that process. But on the next steps, Presiding Officer, they are the organisations that are disappointed that the bill is not coming forward have rightly challenged us to do more with the time that we have within this parliamentary session. It's important that we can still take action in a number of areas, despite the bill not going forward, and that's in particular relation to protecting economic and social rights. In my own portfolio, for example, we've developed interventions like the Scottish Child Payment and our social security system. We'll move forward, should the budget pass, with the effective scrap of the two-child cap. That is the work that we can continue at a policy level. But it is always important that we continue to ensure that we can do everything that we can in those months that we do have left within this session, and I do believe there is a lot that we can do together, Presiding Officer. In conclusion, I hope my remarks today have set an international context to the importance of human rights, but also the important domestic context and the fact that we must continue to challenge ourselves as a Parliament, and we certainly do as a Government, about how we need to go further and make sure that we are developing the human rights framework within the Scottish Parliament and within Scotland, which people have long campaigned for, and they are quite right to do so, Presiding Officer. Thank you.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. I now call on Tess White to speak to and move Amendment 15782.2. Around 7 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Again, I apologise for being late to the Chamber today. Presiding Officer, this Human Rights Day, we're reminded of the importance of protecting everyone's human rights. But multiple failures by this SNP government have seen the human rights of people across Scotland placed in jeopardy. The State of the Nation report from the Scottish Human Rights Commission published today has identified, and I quote, a vast array of challenges for human rights in Scotland and failures that have been unchanged for many years. In an eviscerating letter to the First Minister back in September, more than 100 third sector organisations pointed to the diminishing priority given to human rights by SNP ministers. The letter followed the Scottish Government's decision to renege on the Human Rights Bill. Stakeholders had been working on the project for years, but the SNP marched them up the legislative hill and then marched them down again. Close to £300,000 of taxpayers' money has already been spent on this so-called... I've got a lot to get through, Presiding Officer, so if I've got time at the end, I will. For the past 2 weeks, the Equalities Committee has taken evidence on the Eldan Bill, another piece of legislation kicked into the long grass by Scottish ministers. We heard evidence that up to 90% of women and girls with learning disabilities have been sexually abused. But Marie Todd could only say that she shares the disappointment in the lack of progress. Today, the committee took evidence on the 2020 FGM Act, 4 years later, and it's still not fully in force. Vulnerable women and girls are being failed, but the Minister for Parliamentary Business had the nerve to say this morning, we are where we are. The GRR Bill, of course, was progressed at pace. So was the Hate Crime Bill. But the 2020 FGM Act, the 2021 Domestic Abuse Protection Act and the 2020 Children Act still haven't been fully implemented. More broken promises, Presiding Officer. No. More broken promises, Presiding Officer. More people who feel left behind or ignored. And then there's the NCS Bill. The social care sector is on its knees. We have record levels of delayed discharge, and self-directed support isn't fit for purpose. Scores of people with complex care needs are languishing in hospital settings because of delayed discharge. They're crying out for care packages. The Coming Home implementation programme has clearly failed. The SNP's solution: spend millions of pounds of taxpayers' money on flawed and unworkable legislation which has cost the support of everyone, which which has lost the support of everyone, and everyone except SNP ministers. And actually, Presiding Officer, I don't think it's much to laugh about. Meanwhile, the Scottish Human Rights Commission has raised significant concerns about people's rights and rural proofing. Its report published last month found that food and housing in the Highlands and Islands do not meet minimum core obligations, while health only partially meets obligations. NHS Grampian in my region has the lowest bed base in Scotland, meaning patients in the north of Scotland are suffering the pain and indignity of corridor care and ambulance stacking. This isn't just a health and social care crisis, Presiding Officer, it's a human rights crisis. And that's not all. After trying to invoke a constitutional grievance with the UK government over the UNCRC bill, it took the SNP 709 days to remedy it, playing constitutional games with the rights of children. Meanwhile, the SNP rushed the Gender Recognition Reform Bill through before Christmas 2 years ago, with feminists to her fingertips, Nicola Sturgeon, dismissing the valid concerns of women. More valuable resources were wasted trying to defend the flawed legislation in the Supreme Court. Last month, lawyers acting for the SNP government were on their feet again in the Supreme Court, this time arguing that men could get pregnant, become lesbians and access women-only spaces. Even though John Swinney said he disagreed, even though CoCab Stewart recognised last week that single-sex spaces are a right under the Equality Act, days, literally days, after costly cases in the Supreme Court argued the opposite. And in a thoroughly depressing development, the Scottish Government's case was supported by Amnesty International, who argued against the importance of biological sex, despite this being used to deny women of their fundamental rights in countries such as Afghanistan. Presiding Officer, the balance of rights seems to have tipped so far against women and girls under the SNP that the Scottish Government not only believes that sex can be appropriated, but that the very definition of a woman is contentious ground. All of this, Presiding Officer, shows that the SNP government has struggled to understand the parameters of devolved competence. It has failed to manage the complex balance of rights between competing interests, and it has lacked leadership on the serious challenges we face in Scotland. Too often the SNP says one thing but does another, but the Scottish Government has many of the levers it needs to protect and promote the rights of the Scottish people, even without new legislation. We are calling for urgent, meaningful and common-sense action now. The SNP needs to stop focusing on fringe issues and find ways to address the very real challenges that impact Scots every day. I move the amendment in my name. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms White. I now call on Paul O'Kane to open on behalf of Scottish Labour. Around 6 minutes, please, Mr O'Kane.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. And I am pleased to open in this debate on behalf of Scottish Labour to mark Human Rights Day. It is right and proper that today is a day that is associated internationally with the support of peace and work for peace, because the basis of peace and stability in any society has to be the fullest respect for the human rights of all its people. Not my words, of course, Deputy Presiding Officer, but the words of the late, great John Hume as he received the Nobel Peace Prize on this day in 1998 in Oslo, along with David Trimble. And I would say to colleagues across the chamber that, as I often do, I think there is much we can learn from people like John Hume and David Trimble on building bridges, opening doors and protecting fundamental human rights. And I am proud of my party's place in the story of taking action to protect and defend human rights, because it was a Labour government that introduced the Human Rights Act, ratified the UN Convention on the Rights of Disabled People, and ensured that the Human Rights Act was built into the Scotland Act and the foundational documents of this Parliament. And this year's theme, Our Rights, Our Future Right Now, is a timely reminder of the importance of advancing human rights at home and abroad as a route to addressing many of the issues that we face in our world in a dignified and equitable way. And in opening the debate, the Cabinet Secretary referred to some of the corners of the world where we know human rights have been under threat, and that we must do more as an international community to protect human rights, not least in Ukraine, the Middle East and in Syria. And I am pleased in opening this debate to speak about the many places that we have been able to work constructively with the Scottish Government to do more to advance human rights here in Scotland where we can. And I think in particular around the advocacy of children's rights, as seen in the cross-party support for actions such as the incorporation of the UN Convention of the Rights of the Child into Scots law and the establishment of the Children and Young People's Commissioner. Because I think it is important, where there is consensus, that we should work cross-party. And I've heard much of what has been said in the Cabinet Secretary's opening about how we can do more in order to advance human rights here in Scotland. And I very much welcome the spirit and tenor of the discussion with the new UK Government. And I will take an intervention on that point.
Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I thank Paul O'Kane for allowing me to put on record the fact that the Scottish Government welcomes the fact that we now have a UK Government where we feel not only that we have the foundations and a commitment to human rights, but that we can go further. And as I would have said to the member from the Conservatives which had taken an intervention, clear that that was not the case under the Conservatives, where we felt actually human rights in the UK as a whole were being rolled back on. That is hopefully something that the rest of the Chamber can agree will no longer happen.
Paul O'Kane.
Well, I thank the Cabinet Secretary for her intervention, and I do have more to say about the Conservative amendment and indeed the Conservative prevailing attitude, it seems, towards human rights and access to human rights. But I do thank the Cabinet Secretary for that intervention. However, I will reflect that we have more to do, and that we cannot just talk the talk on human rights. We need to make sure that we are also walking the walk, because we know that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights speaks to us about the fundamental rights to standards of living, ensuring adequate health and well-being of people, and including food, clothing, housing and medical care, all of the issues that we debate, I suppose, every week in this very chamber. And of course, I don't think you'll find much disagreement across the chamber for those principles, and yet we do have to face the facts of the challenges that exist in Scotland right now in terms of many of these issues. Adequate housing, we know that there are record levels of homelessness, a housing emergency and families trapped in temporary accommodation. In terms of medical care, we know that 1 in 6 Scots are stuck on a waiting list for NHS treatment. And, of course, we know there are serious challenges for access to healthcare of particularly vulnerable groups like people who have a learning disability. We know that through recent Freedom of Information requests, people who have a learning disability who were promised health checks have not been able to access those despite the investment by the government. And of course, I'll mention briefly the right to food and my colleague Rhoda Grant's work in leading this, not least through her private member's bill. She was, of course, very hopeful, as were other people around the chamber who have interest in various aspects of human rights policy, that much of this might be covered in a human rights bill. And of course, we have heard already today in our exchanges, and I'm sure we will hear more about this as the debate progresses, about the challenge of the withdrawal of that bill. I hear what the Cabinet Secretary has said, and I've said this to her before, that I appreciate that she wishes to take a longer period of time, but I do think there are really serious disappointment out there, I think, in terms of those who have been invested in this bill process, who have done the work of research and who have worked extremely hard in order to bring us to a place where we can consider all of these issues in the round. So I think what is clear is that we must see more action in order to progress these issues. Indeed, it was Professor Angela O'Hagan, the chair of the Scottish Human Rights Commission, who said that John Swinney and the government have made clear that human rights are not a priority for them. So I do think the government will have to very much reflect on that in terms of how we go forward in this next 18-month period. I would recognise that the Scottish Green Party amendment, which wasn't selected, sought to outline much of that and many of those points, and I have been encouraged by the broad joint working on the Equalities Committee on many of these issues. And if I can turn to the Conservative amendment, I will just make this point, perhaps, before I take an intervention. I think it is disappointing to see the Conservative amendment removing any reference at all to the Council of Europe and its role upholding human rights. Because, to be honest, that's something that previous leaders of the Conservative Party, who understand the importance of cooperation on rights and freedoms, I don't think would have done. But perhaps the Tories appear more interested in clinging to the coattails of Farage rather than someone like John Major. But I'll take an intervention from Ms Gothel if she wishes to.
An intervention from Pam Gosel, if Pam Gosel still wishes to make the intervention. Pam Gosel is joining us remotely. Pam Gosel.
Sorry, I didn't make an intervention. I don't know what happened there.
All right, okay. I don't think Ms Gosel is trying to intervene. Paula King.
That's fine. I mean, it is a fairly difficult position to defend, that you want to remove any reference to the Council of Europe and the European Convention on Human Rights. But there we go. The Tories are under new management at a UK and a Scottish level, so perhaps that's what we've now come to expect. But I want to be very clear in concluding, Presiding Officer, that Scottish Labour want this government and the UK government and the United Kingdom and Scotland to lead the way, not just in putting down rights on paper, but ensuring that we implement and deliver on those rights properly. Because when we talk about people's rights not being realised or upheld right now, what we mean is children who are struggling, families struggling to get a roof over their head, and all the consequences that flow from policy decisions. I welcome the chance that we have in today's debate to recognise Human Rights Day 2024. But what matters, and what will clearly matter, is that we must make significant change to ensure that long-promised action is actually put into effect by all of us in this chamber and by governments across these islands to give people their dignity and their rights. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr O'Kane. I now call on Maggie Chapman to open on behalf of the Scottish Greens. Around 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. We know that human rights matter. We in the Scottish Parliament and Scottish civil society have been talking for nearly 2 decades about the incorporation of economic, social and cultural rights into Scottish law. And for almost a whole decade, the Scottish Government has been committed to it. We know that fulfilment of those rights, rights to education and health, to work and social security, to food and housing, to a decent standard of living and participation in cultural life, all are essential in themselves so that individuals and families can thrive. But they are also vital for our shared life together, to give people the space, the tools, the capacity to care for one another and for our living planet, to grow the safe and sustainable communities without which we would have no real future at all. And we in the Scottish Greens steadfastly hold on to that commitment. We believe that incorporating rights into robust law with clear minimum core obligations and duties of progressive realisation would represent not just a single tool, but a whole workshop of mechanisms to address our key priorities: child poverty, climate and nature degradation, inequality and the insidious spread of toxic attitudes and actions. As we in the Equalities, Human Rights and Civil Justice Committee heard in evidence this October, the Scottish Human Rights Act we hoped to see would have ensured the constitutional priority of human rights, overriding the short-term interests of any particular political party. It would have embedded human rights into the heart of decision-making and made brutal cuts, like that to winter fuel payments, not only morally but legally unacceptable. That was a vision that we believed was shared by the Scottish Government, which was why the decision not to bring forward the bill during this Parliament, communicated so starkly by its absence in the programme for government, was such a raw shock and a profound disappointment. And that shock and disappointment were felt equally acutely by the individuals and organisations who have worked so hard on the process to date. So many people gave up so much time and energy, not just physical and mental, but emotional energy, in telling their stories of pain and trauma, believing that would lead, in known and measured timescales, to a groundbreaking and transformational law. Now, I appreciate the difficulties which have arisen as a result of the Supreme Court's UNCRC decision and the hope the Cabinet Secretary has for opportunities to work with the new UK Government. But the judgment was 3 years ago, and the change at Westminster no great surprise. No state secrets would have been betrayed if the Scottish Government had shared a little more communication shown a little more courtesy, a little more respect, because people are angry. There was a gathering of human rights activists outside this building at lunchtime today. They are angry, frustrated and disappointed. I share their anger, frustration and disappointment. But this is not just about hurt feelings. This is about our relationships as a parliament with our citizens, the organisations we rely on to do vital life-saving work, our partners in the endeavour to make our world a better place. Trust has been broken, Presiding Officer, as further evidenced by the Just Citizens Group open letter to the Cabinet Secretary. This group highlighted not only the scrapping of the Human Rights Bill, but also the Disability Equality Plan, the funding of weapons manufacturers and other issues as examples where consultation was carried out and then subsequently ignored. These community groups, grassroots organisations and advocacy and support networks feel tokenised and exploited, their words. Their engagement serving as, and again I quote, backdrops for performative gestures. But there are ways to rebuild trust. In the words of a gypsy traveller who took part in recent work with MECOP and the Scottish Women's Budget Group that I was pleased to hear about in a webinar earlier today, listen to us, to our communities, listen to our voices. It's our lived experiences. But don't just listen, act on what we say, not just ticking boxes to say you've listened. In my closing speech, Presiding Officer, I'll outline some of the other ways that we need to take to consider and act on to help rebuild that trust. Because, as Angela O'Hagan reminded the Equalities Committee, members of this Parliament are all to be guarantors of human rights. I believe it is at the heart of our role in relation to the rights of people in Scotland and beyond who are profoundly affected by what we do and equally by what we fail to do. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Chapman. I now let's call Hamilton in around 5 minutes. Mr Cole-Hamilton.
Thank you very much indeed, Presiding Officer. It gives me great pleasure to rise for the Liberal Democrats in this important debate, as I have done in each of the 8 years I have been a parliamentarian. I'm glad that we take this time, once a year, to reflect on the importance of human rights and human rights defenders the world over. And over the weekend, we were offered, if ever we needed one, an example in the collapse of the Assad regime in Syria of why that reflection, of that reminder, is so critical, so important. Because for so long, the Syrian people have been persecuted, tortured, denied the most basic, fundamental human rights that we debate today under that brutal dictatorship. Sedania prison, pictured last night on our TV screens, known as the slaughterhouse, was one of many places where people suffered, just one of the dungeons where thousands of people disappeared. I am heartily glad that Assad is gone and he now must face justice for the crimes he committed. There is no knowing what will fill the vacuum to come now he has left. We must hope, for the sake of the Syrian people, that this is a genuine turning point and that there are free and fair elections in line with international law. In Syria, in Gaza, across the Atlantic in Haiti, we see the measure of the challenge that falls to our generation of human rights defenders. Around the world, we know that human rights, democracy and the rule of law are under threat. We see evidence of this in the oppression of the Uyghur people in China, Putin's murderous actions in Ukraine, his slaughter of civilians in Bucha, and his kidnap and removal of thousands of Ukrainian children. Presiding Officer, the Human Rights Declaration was forged amidst the rubble and the atrocity of war some 80 years ago, and yet it finds symmetry and relevance in the rubble and the atrocity of today. Those of us born after that time are duty-bound to defend those rights which so many gave their lives for, and we must never take those rights or those democratic freedoms for granted. However, we must also look closer to home, identify where we too are falling short, and we are. At FMQs last Thursday, I raised the case of women in Caithness who are forced to travel 100 miles through the snow and the ice, in the dark and the deer, in winter to deliver their babies in Inverness. And the Scottish Human Rights Commission published a report a fortnight ago which called the situation faced by those pregnant women as barbaric. It even revealed incidents where women have lost their fertility due to complications caused by inequalities in healthcare in delays in accessing Raigmore Hospital. Under this government, this has been going on for years. It's utterly unacceptable, and it is as a result of the maternity unit at Caithness General in work having been downgraded from consultant-led to midwife-led in 2016. The SHRC report also investigated the challenges people in rural parts of Scotland face accessing their human rights to health, to housing and to food. And I thank my Liberal Democrat colleague Liam MacArthur, Deputy Presiding Officer, for the work he did in helping the Commission to gather evidence for the report. It found that the housing situation in his constituency of Orkney is so poor that people are being forced to turn down job offers because they can't find somewhere to live. While even victims of abuse are unable to find accommodation living away from those who have abused them. Meanwhile, on the Western Isles, parents and carers of children and adults with learning disabilities are having to travel up to 500 miles every single week to access education. And too often, they're travelling on unsuitable roads with little or no access to public transport. In Skye, the road infrastructure has not been upgraded for 20 years. That's despite a huge increase in visitors to the island. It should go without saying, Presiding Officer, that no matter where in Scotland you live, you should have parity of access to human rights. At the moment, our rural communities are being left out of that. They're being left behind. They're tired of being that afterthought. Presiding Officer, I was so pleased as a former youth worker when we finally passed the UN Convention of the Rights of the Child into Scots law, which seeks to uphold the rights of children, but I feel duty bound, again, as I did in my intervention to the Cabinet Secretary, to mention the fact that the age of criminal responsibility in this country is below the international floor set by the UN Committee. I've done many times. And at the moment, you can get a criminal record from as young as 12, and we know that affects the life chances of those young people. To put in context, as I said earlier, in Russia, in China, that age is set at 16. So to conclude, Presiding Officer, I welcome this renewed focus on human rights. I am glad that we can speak with one voice in recognising their vital importance, but for the sake of people right across this country, our words need to be backed by government action. Thank you.
Thank you. We now move to the open debate. I call first Keith Brown to be followed by Rhoda Grant. Around 5 minutes. Mr Brown.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I think it's probably a more serious occasion than usual to discuss human rights, given the state of human rights around the world. I think we're facing an increasingly stark reality, whereby across Europe and beyond, far-right populism, xenophobia and anti-immigrant rhetoric are on the rise. And also in a number of EU and non-EU countries in Europe, where we're seeing democracy under threat and human rights increasingly being disregarded. Of course, in the US as well, a country which perhaps has the strongest constitution in the world in terms of the protection of individual rights. We're seeing a turning point with toxic populism, the undermining of human rights, and also here in the UK we are witnessing the same troubling trends. So I would say to Paul O'Kane, it's not just in the corners of the world. This is an open view in so-called democracies as well, where we see this threat. And the UK Government's hostile stance towards refugees and migrants, exemplified by the Stop the Boat slogan, dehumanises vulnerable people and undermines core values of compassion and respect for human rights. And I think if we think of the one example, erasing children's cartoons in a refugee camp gives you some idea of what the attitude of the recent Tory government was to human rights. And their attempts to weaken the European Convention on Human Rights present a dangerous threat. And of course, we have to remember that one of the initial signatories, one of the inspirations for that declaration was Winston Churchill, who saw what had happened in the First and Second World Wars and believed it absolutely vital that we have institutions which protect human rights. And I say that, of course, as this Parliament's member of the Council of Europe. Scotland's taken a different path. While the UK drags Scotland out of the EU, despite our overwhelming vote to remain, we hold fast to the principles of human rights. Our opposition to Brexit, which has exacerbated anti-immigrant sentiment and weakened human rights protections, is a clear reflection of our commitment to upholding dignity and democracy. The recent commencement of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, Incorporation Scotland Act 2024, of course struck down initially by a Conservative government, even though the Conservatives in this place had voted for it, demonstrates our firm commitment to a rights-based approach. And we're also committed to global human rights, as seen in our leadership on the international stage, such as our call for a ceasefire in Gaza and our unflinching support for Ukraine in its fight against Russia's illegal invasion. It's also crucial, too, that we stand firm and never roll back on human rights protections in areas like hard-won women's rights, and while there may be political pressure to backtrack in areas such as LGBT rights, the Scottish Government, in my view, must remain resolute in its commitment and to ensure that our progress continues. I have a great deal of sympathy for some of the human rights organisations which are expressing concern about the lack of progress, but I also am convinced of the Scottish Government's intentions in terms, and its track record in terms of human rights protections. We cannot allow populist rhetoric or external pressures to diminish the rights of our people or undermine our achievements. Our role should be to protect, advance and strengthen human rights for future generations. And on this Human Rights Day, it's essential that we also recognise the vital role of the Council of Europe as it marks the 75th anniversary. I just wonder, as I say, as the Parliament's nominee and representative on the Council of Europe's Congress for Local and Regional Authorities, I wonder how my alternate, Alexander Stewart, feels about the excising of any mention of the Council of Europe in the Tory amendment. I can tell him that there are many Tories, Andrew Buff springs to mind, from elsewhere in the UK that are absolutely staunch in their defence of the Council of Europe. And I would certainly give my wholehearted support to its mission to uphold human rights, democracy and the rule of law, which are more important than ever, especially as we face growing challenges to these values across Europe. Scotland's human rights commitment to human rights sets us apart. We continue to show leadership in defending rights and standing up for justice. However, we can't ignore that our human rights agenda is at risk, whilst decisions affecting us are still made in Westminster. Independence, in my view, would ensure that the values we uphold, compassion, respect for human rights and democracy, are protected in every policy decision made here in Scotland. Presiding Officer, as we commemorate Human Rights Day, we should reaffirm our commitment to a future where human rights are protected, not just in Scotland, but across Europe and the world. We stand with the Council of Europe in its essential mission, and we commit to continuing our efforts to safeguard the dignity and rights of all individuals. We should do that regardless of the proximity of elections, in which, of course, we all have an interest. These things should be permanent commitments that we make. Above all, we should stand firm, protect the progress that we've made, and never allow the forces of division to roll back our hard-won rights.
Thank you, Mr Brown. I can advise the Chamber we have got a bit of time in hand, so if members are taking interventions, they will certainly get the time back. I call Rhoda Grant to be followed by Karen Adam. A generous 5 minutes. Ms Brand.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The theme for this year's Human Rights Day is Our Rights, Our Future, Right Now. And that's timely given the Scottish Human Rights Commission report, Economic, Social and Cultural Rights in the Highlands and Islands, because it paints a very poor picture of people's access to human rights in my region. And across the 9 areas researched, people of the Highlands and Islands fail to have any single human right delivered to them in a way that meets all the conditions of adequacy under international law. And that's not something to be taken lightly. With regard to housing, the report says the Commission's evidence indicates that a significant number of people across the Highlands and Islands are living in conditions of rooflessness with no temporary accommodation or shelter, and this includes individuals in temporary caravans, camping pods and those sofa surfing. The report highlights that the cost of renting and buying is a significant barrier, especially to young people. If people can't find a place to live, they leave, and that adds to depopulation. The report also states that there is inadequate social housing to meet local needs, and yet the Scottish Government used funds earmarked for rural housing to build around cities. On the right to health, the Commission expresses critical concerns about the lack of local health services. As Alec Cole-Hamilton said, people having to travel long distances to access healthcare, as they do in Caithness for maternity services. But this is also about basic as well as complex health needs. They tell us that for young people in Sutherland, face-to-face mental health services are virtually non-existent. That's for our young people. They found that people are not accessing health services because of the distance and costs, which meant people become very ill, needing hospital care for conditions that could have been treated locally had services been available. In comparison with health, the right to culture appears less important, but their findings are also stark. The lack of public transport stops people participating in cultural activities, and the report highlights that children in Kinlochbervie faced a 120-mile round trip to access football training. Presiding Officer, I've been pursuing our right to food as a reality, and on that the Commission say measures implemented so far have not been sufficient to effectively reduce hunger or address the deterioration of the right to food. I will.
Keith Brown.
Thank Rhoda Grant for taking intervention. She'll be aware, I'm sure, of the writings of R.H. Tawney, who said that the liberty without the quality is a noble sound with a squalid result. She's making the case for economic and social rights. Does she think that the cut in winter fuel payment or the two-child cap help advance economic rights in Scotland and in the Highlands?
Rhoda Grant.
And indeed, the Scottish Labour Party have come forward with proposals to deal with heating. And this Scottish Government is the government that give a flat rate of cold weather payment to everybody, regardless of where they lived. £50, whether your bill be £1,000 or £100. So I would ask the member to look at their own record before casting aspersions on ours. The report continues, testimonies demonstrate that a significant number of people in the Highlands and Islands are currently deprived of sufficient food due to high costs and general poverty conditions. That's in the Highlands and Islands. The report also draws attention to unstocked shops due to ferry cancellations being an issue. And every islander knows to keep a freezer stocked for that emergency. But people who are living hand-to-mouth when shops are empty go hungry. Presiding Officer, I will continue to pursue the Right to Food Bill to realise every citizen's right to food. It is essential that we make sure that people have their right to food because it impacts directly on health and life expectancy due to poor nutrition. And while the work of food banks is a lifeline and those that deliver those services have to be applauded, it's dehumanising to be forced to depend on them. We've heard the Scottish Government's proposed and promised Human Rights Bill could have been a catalyst to put right those wrongs, but it's been shelved. So I would again ask the Cabinet Secretary for help to bring forward this bill by making available to the Non-Government Bills Unit their findings when they pursued their own human rights bill. Presiding Officer, the Scottish Government have levers to hand to realise human rights. They have power over housing, health and food. They could use procurement powers to make sure that people were paid the real living wage, not have 0-hour contracts. They could also use agricultural subsidies to ensure that food is produced locally as possible, making sure that there are no food deserts where the only food available is low quality. And they should also review the patient transport scheme to make sure that nobody finds it too expensive to access health care. With the powers that they do have, the Scottish Government could make huge difference to people's lives and realise many of their human rights. And I quote the Human Rights Commission report, "Minimum core obligations must be met at all times and under all circumstances. Efforts should be focused on addressing these shortcomings." And I look forward to the Scottish Government's response to that report.
Thank you, Ms Grant. I now call Karen Adam to be followed by Bill Kidd. Again, a generous 5 minutes. Ms Adam.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I ask for your patience and that of the Chamber as I talk with this raspy voice today. It's a pleasure to have the opportunity to speak in this Chamber on Human Rights Day. Human rights are often spoke of in grand terms, but at their core, they're about the basics of how we treat one another. They're about ensuring that no matter who you are, you can live with dignity, have your voice heard and your needs met. For me, this is what makes human rights not just a policy issue, but a matter of justice and fairness. Scotland has made real strides in human rights. We've championed equal marriage, set up the Scottish Human Rights Commission and worked to incorporate the UN Convention of the Rights of the Child into our laws. These achievements didn't happen by accident. They happened because we chose to put people and their rights first. But time and again, we have hit the same wall, our constitutional limitations. Take the UNCRC bill. The Parliament unanimously backed legislation to protect the rights of every child in Scotland, but Westminster challenged it. Parts of the bill were ruled out with our competence, forcing us to dilute its scope. And it wasn't a failure of this Parliament or of our government. It was a failure of a system that prevents us from fully delivering what Scotland needs. And that's just one example. The gap between Scotland's priorities and Westminster's actions is widening. Brexit stripped us of the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights. Discussions in Westminster about scrapping the Human Rights Act or withdrawing from the European Convention on Human Rights send a chilling message about the direction of travel. While Scotland is trying to strengthen protections, we are left mitigating the damage caused by policies that we didn't vote for. And this brings me to the proposed Human Rights Bill. It's one of the most ambitious pieces of legislation Scotland has ever considered. And the bill isn't about lofty ideals. It's about addressing the real, immediate challenges that people face every day. It aims to incorporate international treaties that recognise the right to adequate food, housing, healthcare and a healthy environment. And these are fundamental rights that underpin a decent standard of living and a fair society. This bill could be transformative for Scotland. It could provide a legal framework that protects people from discrimination and gives real meaning to the idea of equality. The Government has said that it will bring forward the bill next session, and while that is welcome, we can't ignore the urgency of the issues it's designed to address. But let's be honest, Presiding Officer, even with this bill, we're still operating within limits. Until Scotland has full powers, we will continue to face barriers. And I acknowledge that the Cabinet Secretary has optimism on the constructive working relationship that we will hopefully have with the new UK Government. And I sincerely hope that we do have some progress on this. But for the ability to make decisions that work for Scotland and ensure that the rights of everyone in Scotland can be protected without interference or compromise, the ideal is Scottish independence. And this isn't just about Scotland either. On Human Rights Day, we're reminded of our responsibility to contribute to the global effort to protect and uphold human rights. As part of the Council of Europe for 75 years, we've seen how international collaboration can strengthen democracy and the rule of law. Scotland has a role to play in that, but we need the powers to act as an equal partner on the world stage. So, Presiding Officer, as we mark this occasion, let's recognise the progress we've made, but also the work that remains. Scotland has the ambition and the talent to be a leader in human rights, but we need the tools to deliver. Legislation like the Human Rights Bill will be a vital step forward, and it must be met with the urgency that it does deserve. But ultimately, if we're serious about protecting and advancing human rights, we must be serious about Scotland's future as an independent country. Thank you.
Thank you. I now call the final speaker in the open debate, Bill Kidd. Again, a generous 5 minutes. Mr Kidd.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I hope that today's debate reminds us all of our collective responsibilities to stand up for and defend human rights, not only here in Scotland, but, as the motion states, globally. It's a moment to reflect on the progress we've made and to renew our resolve to confront the challenges that remain both here in Scotland and across the globe. Human rights are not abstract ideals, they are the foundation of just and sustainable societies. While 2024 has presented significant challenges, it has also created opportunities for meaningful progress, and Scotland must seize these opportunities to lead with compassion, vision and determination. We've taken notable steps, including the commencement of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child Incorporation Scotland Act 2024. This landmark achievement is a testament to what we can accomplish when we work together to enshrine human rights in law. Yet there is much more to do. Presiding Officer, I wholeheartedly believe that education must be at the heart of building a strong human rights culture, and our schools are where the values of fairness, equality and justice take root. And it's essential that our young people are not only aware of their own rights, but also equipped with a global perspective. Embedding human rights education in our curriculum is essential. This must include a focus on global peace and security. For instance, educating young people about the catastrophic humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons is a vital part of Scotland's long-standing advocacy of disarmament. Scotland's leadership on nuclear disarmament is well known, and our young people deserve to understand why this matters. They should learn about the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, the indiscriminate devastation caused by these weapons, and the moral, legal and human rights arguments for their abolition. Empowering our youth with this knowledge will enable them to become informed and active citizens, contributing to a more peaceful and equitable future. Environmental justice is another crucial area where education and action cross. The fight to protect our planet is inseparable from the fight to protect human rights. And I'm proud to have supported Monica Lennon MSP's Ecocide Prevention Scotland Bill, which seeks to criminalise severe environmental harm. And this groundbreaking legislation will reflect the understanding that environmental destruction directly threatens human lives and communities. Incorporating the principles of ecocide prevention into our legal framework and educational system will ensure that young people understand the links between environmental protection, human rights and their own futures. This is about more than law. It is about fostering a culture of care and responsibility for the natural world that sustains us all. And, Presiding Officer, Scotland's commitment to human rights must extend beyond our borders, and in an interconnected world we cannot ignore the plight of those affected by human rights abuses elsewhere. The situation in Gaza is a stark and urgent reminder of the crises we face globally. Reports from Amnesty International and the International Criminal Court suggest that acts committed there may constitute a form of genocide. The Genocide Convention obliges all nations, including the UK and Scotland, to prevent and respond to such atrocities. And while I appreciate that arms exports are overall a reserved matter, Scotland has an ethical responsibility to ensure its actions and policies do not contribute to human rights violations. And if there are any doubts over this, then these concerns need to be properly addressed. If we want to talk the talk, as has been said already, then we must walk the walk. Presiding Officer, International Human Rights Day is not just a time to reflect, it's a time to act. By advancing the Human Rights Bill, embedding comprehensive human rights education into our schools, supporting initiatives like the Ecocide Prevention Bill and addressing ethical concerns and funding practices, we can lead the way in creating a fairer, safer and more sustainable world. Scotland has a proud history of progress and innovation. From the principles of the Scottish Enlightenment to our leadership in social justice, we have shown what is possible when values guide actions. Let's continue this legacy by ensuring that human rights are not just ideals, but lived realities for all. Together, we can create a Scotland and a world that truly embodies the principles of equality, dignity and justice. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr Kidd. We now move to the closing speeches, and I call Maggie Chapman again. Generous 5 minutes, Ms Chapman.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. In the Cabinet Secretary's letter to the Equalities Committee, she wrote of, and I quote, her determination to use the remainder of this parliamentary session to further develop and strengthen the Human Rights Bill. Now is the time for that determination to be shown. We need to see progress towards that promised bill, but we also need to see rapid movement along other pathways, including the public sector equality duty. Too many human rights issues have been left on the back burner, waiting for the bill. They cannot wait any longer. The right to food demands tangible action, including fulfilment of the promises on free school meals. The right to a healthy environment cannot be fulfilled while the Scottish Government remains in breach of its Aarhus obligations and fails to look properly at issues of environmental governance and specialist courts. The human rights of disabled people should have been at the heart of the bill. The budget announcement about the Disability Equalities Plan has been described by Inclusion Scotland as a step in the right direction. But the fundamental and deeply justified demands of disabled people-led organisations have still not been fully met. And remedies for broken rights are scarce and hard to find, hidden in the complex and opaque systems, blocked by lack of time, lack of expert help, lack of resources. Legal aid reform, so long overdue, is a part of the picture, and I hope to see human rights at its heart when it happens. If our rights are unenforceable, our rights are not real. Human rights are global in two senses. Rights that we have in Scotland because they are universal, but also rights of others across the world for which we may bear some responsibility. And I want to speak briefly about three of those situations. The impact of climate change can represent profound breaches of human rights. The International Court of Justice is currently hearing evidence in preparation for its advisory opinion on the responsibilities of states in relation to climate change. It may find that countries, especially those of the minority world, the global north, owe duties significantly beyond those of the Paris Agreement, duties about the prevention of human rights violations, as well as reactions once they have happened. The UK bears a heavy burden in terms of its historical responsibility, its carbon emissions, but also its empire, its slavery profits, its suppression of other economies, its position in the web of global finance. And Scotland can't avoid its share of culpability. Its loss and damage work so far is important, but falls far short of what is really needed. In Sudan, conflict has led to over 100,000 deaths, millions of people forced to move from their homes, and tens of millions in need of necessities, including food, water and healthcare. People have been arbitrarily detained, tortured and killed, women subjected to severe sexual violence. These are human rights violations of the most basic and brutal form, and the global north has barely noticed. And in Gaza, too, the most fundamental of human rights to health, to home, to life itself are being systematically and deliberately denied, especially to children. The responsibility of the UK is grave, broad and deep, but the Scottish Government does not have clean hands either. There could be no better way to mark Human Rights Day than to end financial support for companies that profit from genocide. Presiding Officer, on this Human Rights Day, on the day when we rightly reaffirm our commitment to human rights, we must, I believe, also be clear about what that means for us as politicians who have the immense privilege to make decisions on behalf of all citizens. It means taking seriously that responsibility, listening to our citizens and acting in their interests, not in the narrow interests of the corporate elite or military powers. One of the young women outside Parliament at lunchtime today spoke very powerfully, and with apologies for my less than perfect recall, she said, "My generation was born fighting, but I am tired. Tired of fighting for better housing, for a clean environment, for trans people, for refugees, for asylum seekers. Tired of fighting for an end to genocide, for justice." Because that's what human rights are for justice. Not only for those of us here now who live in warm, safe homes with family and community around us, but for everyone, everywhere in the world, and we all share responsibility in that. Thank you.
Thank you. And I call Faisal Chowdhury, again, a generous 5 minutes. Mr Chowdhury.
Thank you. Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I'm pleased to close the debate on behalf of the Scottish Labour and join members in making Human Rights Day 2024. As my colleague Paul O'Kane mentioned, the Labour Party has a history of protecting human rights. It was the transformative post-war Labour government which helped establish our human rights system, and from the Council of Europe. As Alex Cole-Hamilton reminded us, how the events of recent days shows we should not take those rights for granted. And I echo the Cabinet Secretary's remarks on human rights being a force for good and key to global peace. Members have shared their disappointment that the Scottish Government has broken its promise on bringing forward a human rights bill this parliamentary session. The theme of this year's Human Rights Day is Our Rights, Our Future, Right Now. The Scottish Government seems to be using the theme Our Rights, Our Future, Not Now. Members have praised human rights defenders, but organisations are today protesting outside Parliament after another broken SNP promise. As Maggie Chapman mentioned, the protest, the disappointment felt by the organisation and individuals pushing for this law, and their loss of trust in the Scottish Government. Tess White mentioned the open letter signed by over 100 organisations, which called the Scottish Government's decisions to kick the Human Rights Bill into the long grass, a dismissal of the human rights issue facing Scottish people. An open letter from Just Citizen states they are tired of being used as just a box-ticking exercise. Another organisation has stopped engaging with the Scottish Government altogether due to broken promises. We must note that incorporation right into law is not cure-all for the issue we face. SNP First Minister have declared human rights to be priority and a great success of devolution. But evidence presented by the Scottish Human Rights Commission says otherwise. Members like Tess White, Alex Cole-Hamilton, Rhoda Grant mentioned the report on human rights in the Highland and Islands, which found Scotland failing to meet core minimum obligation on food and housing. The SHRC review on condition in prison and forensic mental health setting also found 83% of recommendation by human rights bodies had yet to be implemented over the last 10 years. With our prison debt being some of the highest in Europe, that is not good enough. The Scottish Government, regardless of the Human Rights Bill being delayed, needs to deliver on existing rights. To conclude, Presiding Officer, I am pleased to join members in reaffirming our commitment to human rights. I understand the process of incorporating human rights into the Scots law has been complicated by the judgment of the Supreme Court. As members Karen Adam and Kit Brown have mentioned today, but the Scottish Government is still able to meet the current obligation. The Supreme Court does not prevent the Scottish Government from taking the housing emergency, from delivering a human prison system, or ensuring no child goes hungry. I hope the Scottish Government will recognise the issues raised in this debate and mark Human Rights Day through action to protect the existing right of Scots. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Chowdhury. And I now call on Jeremy Balfour, again a very generous 6 minutes. Mr Balfour.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. On days like these, it's important to look back at the progress we have made. Scotland and the West more broadly has made major leaps forward when it comes to human rights. And it's right that we take a step back and reflect on that progress and in the price paid by those who guaranteed it. But the danger of a debate like... Can I just make a wee bit of progress? The danger of a debate like this, and I think with respect to some members, we have fallen into this, is that we pat ourselves on the back and say how well we're doing. We look at other jurisdictions and maybe critique them. But if you're a homelessness person, if you're a woman here in Scotland, there is so much more progress that needs to be made. And we must also just give me in front of this paragraph. But we must also look forward and acknowledge that there is much work still to do here in Scotland. And there are still many people who do not enjoy the full suite of rights. Mr Stewart.
Kevin Stewart.
I thank Mr Balfour for taking the intervention, and I agree with him that there is always progress to be made in all of this. But I wonder if Mr Balfour would agree with me that it would be the stupidest of moves to withdraw from the European Court of Human Rights or to not regard the work of the Council of Europe like many of his party would like to see. And I would hope that Mr Balfour would choose on this occasion to disagree with those in his party who feel that way.
Jeremy Balfour, I'll give you the time back.
Thank you. I will maybe return to that point in a moment. Our rights, our future, right now. That is the theme of this year's Human Rights Day, the reason we're having this debate today. And the theme recognises that rights should not be waited for. They are not an optional extra that government can choose whether to honour or not. They cannot be ignored. It is the most fundamental role of government at all levels to protect these rights and ensure that all citizens are free to live their lives and achieve their potential. But for too long, Deputy Presiding Officer, vulnerable and marginalised people in Scotland have been denied that freedom. Disabled people in Scotland feel like they have been left behind, and if we are honest with ourselves, this Parliament has done very little in recent years to address this sorry fact. And if I may, I want to focus my remarks today around the final two words of our theme, right now. You see, Deputy Presiding Officer, there is an urgency to it. It sums up the feelings of disabled people across Scotland. We've been told to wait for too long, and we are frankly fed up. There's always a million different reasons that disabled people are given for waiting. It's not a priority right now. We don't have the money right now. There are broader issues to be addressed right now. But with respect, none of these wash. Disabled people continue to experience hardship and disadvantage that others do not. We are tired of being told to wait. We are tired to campaign and see so little achieved in this so-called modern Scotland. I have to give way.
Keith Brown.
Can I thank Jeremy Balfour for giving way? I wonder if he's able to shed any light on what the thinking is behind the Conservatives taking out the reference to the Council of Europe in the motion by the Scottish Government, given, as I've said, it was supported by, partially devised by Winston Churchill. What is their objection to marking the 75th anniversary of the Council of Europe?
Jeremy Balfour.
I am so disappointed, Deputy Presiding Officer, that the member is not listening to what I am saying. Is he just simply so blinkered he will not listen to what the disabled community will make, but wants to make a political point?
Cabinet Secretary.
To the member for giving way. On the subject of right now we are in the middle of a budget process. Right now we are in a minority government and we need to seek support elsewhere. So if there are concrete proposals, costed proposals, that the Scottish Conservatives want to come up with, then right now is the opportunity to do that, to take it out of this debate in the Chamber and to put it into context reality. But he also has to explain how he can do that while his party is looking for tens of millions of pounds of tax cuts. But the offer is there right now to actually have a constructive discussion on that in detail.
Jeremy Balfour, and give you the time back for both those interventions.
Thank you. And a bit like the Cabinet Secretary said, perhaps she's reading my notes, because I'm coming on to that in this very second. Because ask any disability organisation about the current state of disability in Scotland, and they will paint a dreary picture. That is supposing that they're still open to operate after their budgets have been slashed to nothing. As our amendment makes note of today, the Disability Equality Plan had been widely condemned as not worth the paper it's written on. A process that began with good intentions has ended, in the words of Inclusion Scotland, Glasgow Disability Alliance and Disability Equality in Scotland, saying a collapse of all promises and imposition. And, Presiding Officer, disabled people and disability organisations are simply not being listened to. They are either ignored or they bear the brunt of this government's cuts. They need a champion. They need a voice that can represent them at all levels of government. And the Cabinet Secretary said, what am I asking for? Well, here it comes. I'm asking for the Scottish Government to confirm that they will support a Commissioner for Disability that will come to this Parliament early next year.
George Adam. When Mr Balfour was talking about disabled people need a champion, I agree with him on that. They do need a champion. But does he not believe that after 14 years of a Conservative government who actually made many of the problems that some of the disabled people are dealing with, I find that hard to actually listen to him and take it seriously. With all due respect to Mr Balfour, surely the Conservative Party in Westminster need to take some responsibility.
Jeremy Balfour.
I firstly don't accept everything that Mr Adams has said there. And I also said we're trying to look forward right now. And so right now, here in Scotland, the disabled community needs someone who can fight on their behalf when they don't have the time or the energy to secure their rights. In short, they need a disability commissioner. And they need it right now. Presiding Officer, in short order, this Parliament will be asked to vote on my proposal for such a Commissioner. And each one of us will be forced to take a side. Will we choose to look to the past? Will we choose to make political points? Or will we choose either the side of giving disabled people the rights and their future they deserve and want and need right now? Or will we choose the side of continuing to ignore their rights and risking not passing any meaningful legislation this term that advances disabled people's rights? That is the choice each of us face in the next few weeks. I hope we'll come on the right side right now. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you. And I call on CoCab Stewart to wind up to 8 minutes. Minister.
I beg your pardon, Presiding Officer. Thank you. Presiding Officer, I refer members to my entry on the Register of Members' Interests as a member of Amnesty International. I thank members for their contributions to this afternoon's debate. They are a reflection of a Parliament that takes the advancement of human rights very seriously, and rightly so. The challenges that the world faces, some of which have been outlined today, are in fact stark. They are a reminder of why we must continue to support the vital work of human rights defenders globally, which Alex Cole-Hamilton raised in his remarks. Human rights defenders come in many forms, such as activists, journalists, lawyers, who often risk their lives on a daily basis to defend and protect human rights. That is why I am proud that this government continues to provide support for the Scottish Human Rights Defenders Fellowship, delivered by the University of Dundee in collaboration with Amnesty International, Peace Brigades International and Frontline Defenders. Since 2018, we have welcomed 19 individuals from 16 countries, providing them with a place of safety to carry out their vital work. And it was indeed a privilege to meet with some of the defenders last month during their visit to Scotland to hear firsthand about their work. Now, I would like to turn to some responses to the contributions that were made in the Chamber. As expected, human rights covers a wide and extensive range of issues, so please forgive me if I am not able in a short time to touch on all of those areas. With regards to the Conservatives' amendment, I don't need to say, but I will not miss this opportunity to reiterate the absence of the reference of the work of the Council of Europe and, in fact, its 75th anniversary. And many colleagues have already put that on record. So I suppose from my point of view, it is very difficult for me to be taking lessons from the Conservative opposition party who cannot actually decide whether they are for human rights or whether they are not. But this government certainly is for advancing human rights. With regards to specific comments regarding female genital mutilation, which of course is absolutely illegal in Scotland, implementation of the Female Mutilation Protection and Guidance Scotland Act, the Scottish Government has invested in a range of projects with a specific FGM focus through equally safe funding. For example, the Community Information Sources Change project that seeks to combat FGM through awareness raising, particularly amongst males within affected communities. I go on to the contributions of Paul O'Kane, and he quite rightly, I understand him asking for more action, and that is a priority. The Rights Incorporation agenda is continuing at pace, and we are absolutely committed to it. I share his optimism regarding the collaborative work that can now hopefully take place with the incoming UK Government, and the early signs are very good to ensure that the most effective change can take place through joint coordination. Maggie Chapman was right to highlight the fact that the Scottish Government does indeed have a bit of work to do to rebuild trust. The Cabinet Secretary has herself and myself have put on record that we absolutely understand and feel keenly the disappointment that has been felt by human rights campaigners. But we must absolutely make sure that we get this right, especially for the rights holders, and we take the time to work all of that through in order to be able to present a bill in the next parliamentary term. But we are absolutely listening. Keith Brown was very eloquent in outlining the fact that we cannot allow the forces of division to roll back our rights, and we must stand firm in our commitment. And he was right to highlight the choice of words that can be used by politicians amongst other folk. And in Scotland, we are a welcoming country, we support human rights defenders, and indeed, each one of us is in fact a human rights defender. So therefore, we must guard against that negative rhetoric that can be bought into. I move on to Rhoda Grant, who obviously mentioned her right to food, a very, very important topic to highlight, and I would like to reassure her that we intend to bring forward the Human Rights Bill in the next parliamentary term, which will include proposals to incorporate the right to food. And regarding her bill in particular, I know that communications are ongoing, and the Scottish Government has shared materials, and we are open to engagement, as has been confirmed by the First Minister recently at FMQs as well. Karen Adam, she was quite right to highlight the international collaboration that is needed to uphold human rights, especially at times of great challenge. And she was also quite right to highlight that it is only with independence that we would be able to further protect our rights with more powers. Bill Kidd, he has asked us all, and I take that challenge, is to seize the opportunities that are given to us and to lead with conviction and compassion to raise the importance of embedding human rights into everything we do, and he highlighted the importance of putting that into education for our next generation. I now come on to Jeremy Balfour, Mr Balfour will know that I absolutely recognise that there is more work to be done. I have never denied that, this government hasn't. But we are willing to roll up our sleeves and get on with the hard work. And that does mean making difficult decisions to pace ourselves so that we get things right and that things are fully costed as well. I have heard very clearly the concerns of disabled people. We have invested an additional £2 million into the 25-26 budget to support the Disability Equality Plan, to deliver essential support, and also the growing of the Independent Living Fund. Now, whilst the opposition raises important points regarding funding, they haven't actually made any specific requests during the budget negotiations. Perhaps they will take this as a reminder to actually do so and come with proposals that can be considered. So, Presiding Officer, there is absolutely no room for complacency. And in closing, I echo the words of Michael O'Flaherty, the Council of Europe Commissioner for Human Rights, who said that human rights, there is no room for complacency. Renewal must be an ongoing process. It must be informed by the need to deliver respects for the human rights of everyone in our societies, in all of their extraordinary diversity. That renewal is the responsibility of each and every one of us in this Parliament. It is what we owe the people of Scotland day in, day out, as we seek to represent them. And it is an endeavour that this government will drive forward with vigour and urgency. The Cabinet Secretary, in her opening remarks, outlined some of the actions that we are taking to respect, protect and fulfil human rights. And as part of this, she reaffirmed our commitment to the Human Rights Bill, a commitment that I know civil society is seeking from all parties in this chamber. As we move forward, we continue to welcome the necessary scrutiny, constructive challenge and collaboration on both the proposed bill and how we collectively advance the wider human rights agenda across everything that we do as a government and as a parliament. And it is this accountability that forms the bedrock of human rights realisation, and one that reflects the imperatives of the International Human Rights Treaty system. Presiding Officer, today, on Human Rights Day, is a reminder that we must unite, whatever our differences, behind the transformative power of human rights to create a pathway for a better future for Scotland and beyond.
Thank you. That concludes the debate on pathways to global human rights towards a stronger human rights culture in Scotland. It's now time to move on to the next item of business, and I am minded to accept a motion without notice under Rule 11.2.4 of Standing Orders that decision time be brought forward to now, and I invite the Minister for Parliamentary Business to move the motion.
Move, Presiding Officer.
Thank you. The question is that decision time be brought forward to now. Are we all agreed? We are agreed, and there are 3 questions to be put as a result of today's business. The first question is that motion 15783 in the name of Siobhan Brown on Judicial Factors Scotland Bill at Stage 3 be agreed. And as this is a motion to pass the bill, the question must be decided by division, so there will be a short suspension to allow members to access the digital voting system.